There I was, standing in court with a stack of evidence in my hands. Across from me, Mark, the head of the HOA, the man who tried to tear down my fence and branded me a violator in front of the whole neighborhood. But when the judge began reading the list of violations, every eye in the courtroom turned to him. Mark went pale, tried to argue, but the documents spoke louder than words. He himself had illegally taken over HOA land. And then something happened that shattered his authority in one single blow. I never got involved in conflicts. I've always believed being a good neighbor meant respect. A casual handshake by the mailbox, a few words about the weather, and a neatly trimmed lawn. I pay my HOA fees on time, don't throw loud parties, and keep my yard in perfect shape. So when I opened that envelope from the HOA and saw I was being accused of violating the rules, my knees literally went weak. The letter was written in dry, bureaucratic language. Your fence has been installed in violation of the regulations. It must be removed within 14 days. Failure to comply will result in a $200 per day fine. No greeting, no explanation. Just an ultimatum. I read the letter 3 times. My pulse quickened and my chest tightened. That fence, neat, freshly painted dark brown, wooden, had only been up for 3 months, replacing the old, leaning, rotted one. I put it there specifically to boost the home's value and add a bit of privacy. Before installation, I did everything by the book. I studied the HOA bylaws, page by page. I ordered a property survey. The contractor I hired was licensed, and together we double-checked the boundaries via GPS. Not a single inch out of line. Everything was clean, transparent, legal. And now, this. Vague threats, fines, pressure. I stood in the middle of the kitchen, letter in hand, feeling a chill crawl down my spine. This wasn't just some administrative notice. It felt like someone had barged into my home without knocking, telling me what I could and couldn't do on my own land. This wasn't about a fence. It was an invasion. I looked out the window, a sunny day, just like any other. But inside, everything felt off. What I felt rising wasn't anger, it wasn't fear, it was confusion. Deep, raw, painful confusion. Why? For what? And what the hell is going on? I did what any reasonable person would do. I tried to talk. No yelling, no threats. I just wanted to understand where this was coming from. I called the HOA chairman, Mark Wilson. We'd barely spoken, even though we've lived in the same neighborhood for about 5 years. He's that guy. The one who starts up his brand new lawnmower every Saturday at 7 a.m., just to remind the whole block that order begins with the sunrise. I'd heard mixed things about him. Some called him a decent guy who keeps things clean, others, a petty dictator with a control complex. But I wanted to give him a chance to explain. Mark answered curtly. No greeting. I introduced myself, started talking about the fence, mentioned that everything was built within legal boundaries and that I had the paperwork. That's when he cut me off. Rules are rules, James. Did you think you could just do whatever you want? He didn't even sound annoyed, just condescending, like he was looking down from a podium. That was it. I went silent, because I realized talking to him was like slamming into a concrete wall. He'd already made up his mind. He didn't care about my documents, didn't care whether I broke any rules. He didn't even want to know. I hung up and realized my fists were clenched. My palms were sweating. I wasn't angry. I was humiliated. He didn't even give me a chance to speak. He put me in my place, like a student who dared to talk back to the principal. The next day, I started noticing looks. Some waved, but a little too quickly. Some smiled, but stiffly. One neighbor, the same guy I used to drink beers with at barbecues, actually turned away when I walked up. So the rumors had started. And Mark, of course, wasted no time painting me as the bad guy, the threat to order, the rebel with the fence. He'd spread his version of the story, and people, not knowing the full picture, bought into it. This wasn't about a few wooden planks anymore. It had become personal. He decided he could tell me how to live on my own land, decided that the power of the HOA gave him the right to push people around. And in that moment, I felt something begin to grow. Not a burst of rage, but something slower. Like poisonous smoke, it started to fill me. I began to hate Mark, not as a neighbor, not as an official, but as a man who believed he had power over me. I realized the talking was over. This wasn't about fence boards. It wasn't about aesthetics. It was about principle. I had to prove, not just to Mark, but to myself, that I wasn't going to be pushed around. I wasn't going to be another casualty of an HOA that thought it could dictate what you're allowed to put in your yard, what color your mailbox should be, and at what angle your garden hose is allowed to lie. So I found a lawyer. His name was Arthur. Older guy, gray hair, worn blazer, sharp eyes that said, "I've seen this before, and I know exactly how to deal with it." He listened in silence, just nodding as I laid everything out. Then he said simply, "This is how we get them." We started with the most important piece, an independent land survey. We compared it to the official property records. 2 weeks later, we had every document we needed. The fence was straight as an arrow, right along my property line, not an inch over, but that was just the beginning. Arthur dug into public records, cross-checked construction permits, and then, with a subtle smirk, said, "You know who actually went over the line? Mark. 2 years ago, Mark had built a carport extension and expanded his patio. No permits, no notices, and part of the structure encroached on land that belongs to the HOA. He was accusing me of violations while boldly stealing a chunk of land from the very association he led. I sat there, folder of documents in my lap, boiling, not from surprise, from rage. He knew. He knew what he was doing, but he assumed I'd cave. He thought I wouldn't have the guts to dig deeper, that I'd back down, like others probably had before me. And that was his biggest mistake. I looked at Arthur and said, "We're going all the way." Because this wasn't about the fence anymore. It was about principles, about the fact that you don't get to bully people just because you wear a tie and call yourself the chairman. And if Mark thought he'd started a war, he had no idea who he was up against. I filed a countersuit, not out of revenge, out of principle, for defamation, for emotional distress, for abuse of power. I didn't play the sympathy card. I just laid out the facts. Photos, land surveys, emails, official records. Everything proving that I wasn't the one breaking the rules. It was the man who dared to call himself the guardian of order. The court hearing was short, but every word hit like a note in a perfectly played song. Mark showed up in a suit, trying to look composed, but his confidence was shaken. His voice trembled as the judge read the documents Arthur and I had submitted, especially the part about his own carport, sitting on HOA land, built without a single permit. The courtroom went still. Even the judge looked away for a moment, as if embarrassed for Mark. And then, it all erupted. The local paper picked up the story. Front page. A photo of Mark from a previous HOA meeting under the headline, "HOA Chair Caught Violating His Own Rules." Neighbors who'd spent weeks avoiding me started saying hello. Some nodded with quiet respect. One man, Jerry, who I used to go fishing with sometimes, came up and said, "I'm sorry, James. I believed the wrong person. You did everything right." It wasn't about applause. It was about finally being seen, being heard, being respected. The court ruled in my favor. The HOA had to pay damages for emotional distress, cover all legal fees, and, most importantly, remove Mark from his position as chairman. That evening, when I got home, I stopped by the fence. The fence. The one that started it all. It stood solid, board by board, perfectly aligned. But now, I saw it differently. It wasn't just a fence anymore. It was a symbol. A symbol that you can't just intimidate a man who stands on principle. I stood there, hands in my pockets, looking at my yard, my home, my land. And I didn't feel rage. I didn't feel triumph. I felt quiet. Peace. I hadn't just won. I had proven, to them and to myself, that I deserved respect. And you know what? That felt damn good.